Good afternoon, all, and welcome. It's wonderful to have you here today. In just a moment, I will be introducing my co-panelists, but I would like to take a moment to thank the Hoover Institution for publishing Unshackled, Freeing America's K-12 Education System, and for hosting this webinar today. We will be having a question and answer session at the end of the webinar. So feel free to submit questions through the Q&A function, which is in the toolbar in the bottom of your Zoom window. Now it is my pleasure to announce our panelists, Hoover Institution Senior Fellow Checker Finn and my co-author, Justice Clint Bolick. Checker Finn has devoted his career to improving American education. He has served in numerous roles, including as former United States Assistant Secretary of Education and as a professor of education at Vanderbilt University. Mr. Finn continues to serve as an education policy analyst and as the president emeritus of the Thomas B. Fordham Foundation. And he serves in numerous other fellowships, such as those with the Hudson Institute and Hoover Institution. Checker has published countless times, and his most recent work, How to Educate an American, The Conservative Vision for Tomorrow's Schools, was published just last year with Michael J. Petrelli. Checker, it is high on my reading list. Thank you for being with us here today. We also have with us Hoover Institution Fellow Justice Clint Bolick. Justice Bolick has devoted many years of his life to education reform and civil rights. Justice Bolick served in government at the EEOC, founded the Landmark Center for Civil Rights, and co-founded the Institute for Justice. Subsequently, he served as general counsel for the Alliance for School Choice and as the vice president of litigation at the Goldwater Institute before being appointed to the Arizona Supreme Court. Throughout his career, Justice Bolick litigated for equitable educational opportunities and school choice. Among other notable cases, Justice Bolick defended the first Wisconsin school voucher program and spearheaded the litigation strategy for the landmark school choice case Zelman versus Simmons-Harris. Because of Justice Bolick's work, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of school vouchers in a decision that would lay the groundwork for many more school choice programs. In his spare time, Justice Bolick is also a prolific author, publishing about education and immigration reform, among other topics. On a personal note, Justice Bolick has been a mentor to me since 2017 and is one of the reasons I became a teacher and soon will be a lawyer. When I was an undergraduate at Notre Dame, I handed Justice Bolick my senior thesis after attending a talk he gave. We met for coffee the next morning to discuss it and remained in touch when I began teaching through Notre Dame's Alliance for Catholic Education program. At the time, I had also begun writing on educational issues for the Washington Examiner, and one day I heard from Justice Bolick. He reached out about a new writing project, a book about what education should look like in the 21st century. That conversation became the basis for Unshackled, which we look forward to discussing today. I'm grateful to both Checker and Clint, as well as the Hoover Institution, for allowing us to do this today. And I will turn it over to Clint now for him to give a few opening remarks about Unshackled.
Well, thank you so much, Kate. It's just been a tremendous delight to have you as co-author on this book. And I was thinking before we got going that Checker and I have been friends and colleagues longer than you've been alive. So I am so honored to have Checker, one of the nation's foremost educational thinkers, with us today. And really, you know, I look at these issues now from a slightly different perspective when I see the people who come before my court and other courts in Arizona, almost all of whom in the criminal justice system have been miseducated. And I also look at the push for diversity on the bench and in colleges and so forth. And we've got a serious problem. Our K-12 system is not producing the kind of qualified students that we need to compete with China and other nations, and certainly to fulfill the incredible promise that every American was given in Brown versus Board of Education of an equal educational opportunity. So as Kate mentioned, really the purpose of this book was to conduct a thought experiment, and we invited all of our readers to do that exact same thing, and that is to imagine what an education system would look like in the year 2021 if we were designing it from scratch with all of the amazing technological tools that we now have at our disposal. And we certainly concluded it would not look much like the system of educating masses of students in warehouses as we do today. And the pandemic has only sharpened our determination to really provoke a debate over some things that have really been sanctified over the years that really should be rethought.
It's a great revolutionary book. It's a treat to be with both of you today. It's a treat to have known Clint for about 1,000 years and to get acquainted with Kate. And I will, before we're done, throw a few anxieties about your prescription, but I certainly share your diagnosis. But it leads me almost immediately to ask either both of you, do you really think we're in such a terrible state today? We were declared a nation at risk in 1983. A lot of people have been struggling at education reform ever since. That's 30 some years of education reform, taking various forms in various places, federal, state, local, you name it. Are we still going to hell in a handbasket educationally?
Well, I'll start off and Kate can join. I would say that looking back on 1983 fills me with nostalgia. We are far worse off today than we were then. Certainly nothing has improved in particular for, or very little has improved in particular for the kids who need education the most, low-income kids, Black students, Hispanic students. The statistics are so depressing. 1 in 14 Black high school seniors is proficient in mathematics. That is an absolute disaster. Tom, and the graduation for Black and Hispanic students is significantly lower than for white and Asian students. Tom Edsall wrote in the New York Times just the other day that fewer than 1 in 4 Black students who do manage to graduate and get into college graduates from college within 4 years. This is a catastrophe. And whatever the situation was in 1983, pretty much the only thing that really has changed is that we've spent a lot more money getting to the same dismal outcomes.
And I would just add on that as well, that I think we have more choice than we had in 1983 in the sense that we won, major Supreme Court victories, Zellman, as I mentioned in the introduction, to expand choice. And Florida has really been a standard bearer in that regard with their tax credit scholarship program. But we still don't have as much choice as is being desired. And we see that when there are lotteries for charter schools. And from an anecdotal perspective, the school where I taught in Chicago, small private Catholic school, 100% lottery admission, and students, we had way more students who wanted to come than we could admit. So I think we've made some progress on the choice front, but it is still not meeting demand.
Your book certainly talks a lot about Florida, and we'll come back to that on the choice front and on the COVID front, because we're just emerging, at least much of the country is. There's more choice resulting from COVID, isn't there? Aren't people doing more homeschooling, more pod schooling, stuff like that? There's a lot of bad stuff coming out of COVID, obviously, but isn't there some good stuff on the choice front?
Yes,
well, absolutely. Oh, go ahead, Kate.
No, I think absolutely there are positives and silver linings from this terrible pandemic, and choice being one of them. And I think it will be really important. Now is the crucial time for policies to be passed, and we have seen that many more policies are being passed. West Virginia passed an ESA program, for example. But we still have more demand than there is supply for these programs.
And that is the main thrust of the remedy in your book, is to create many, many more opportunities for choice and empower parents and so forth. But one of you or both of you need to outline the prescription. How are you going to unshackle the system? What is the main thrust of the book's recommendations for those who haven't had the pleasure to read it yet?
So Checker, and you mentioned it, you said it characterized the book as revolutionary, and I really hope that that's true, because we really need it. The Economist, the issue that's on the newsstands right now, if there are such a thing as newsstands anymore, talks about this really being a Hurricane Katrina that came across the entire United States. And you're absolutely right. Parents took matters into their own hands with these learning pods, micro schools. But for low-income parents, families, the situation is even more dire than it was a year ago. So we think that we need STEM to Stern education reform. Obviously, public schools will continue to be the centerpiece, regardless of how much choice we have. And basically, very briefly, I'll classify our suggestions, our reform proposals, into 4 brief categories. The first is perhaps the most dramatic and rarely talked about, and that is cutting out the middleman in public schooling. We are more bureaucratized as a public school system than Russia, which prides itself on its bureaucracy. And we are organized, our public schools are organized around school districts, which have been obsolete for decades, and they suck about one half of the funds out of the school system and contribute very, very little except political control over the schools. So we would look to make public schools far more autonomous, and have funds flow directly to those schools, and those schools would have far greater autonomy to pay their best teachers more, to hire the teachers and fire the teachers as they see fit, and to design educational programs that best serve their populations. The second really is an offshoot of what I just said, which is decentralizing public schools. We've learned so much from charter schools over the last few decades, and giving regular public schools far greater autonomy, I think, is very important. The third is to promote student-centered learning. Our school system is decades behind our technological revolution. And the Economist article I referenced mentioned how personalized learning is the way that we escape our malaise that we have right now. And we have the technology to, at a fraction of the cost of what we're spending right now, really personalize education to the individual student's needs, talents, abilities. And we've got to be doing far more than that. And finally, student-based funding. We ought to have a funding system that resembles post-secondary education. Our universities have to compete for students. And if they don't successfully compete for students, they don't get that money. And transferring control over education funding from politicians to parents would all by itself effectuate dramatic change in the public schools, so long as we give them the ability to be flexible in return.
Kate, additions?
I would just add on the personalization point, which was point 3 that Clint just mentioned. One of the best things that I had the chance to do when we were writing the book is visit a few innovative schools in Chicago because I was teaching at the time. And when you're a teacher, if there are any teachers on the call, you hear personalization, and it is such a buzzword in education. So I did some research and I figured out what was the most personalized school in Chicago, and ended up being the school right around the corner from my school, and it was called Intrinsic. And I went and visited, and I really saw how they were reinventing education. And we profiled this school and a number of other schools in one of the latter chapters of the book. But really what this school was doing was just blowing up the idea of kids in rows in one classroom. It looked much more like a startup when you walked inside. There were kids doing individual work in one section, and then with private tutors in another, working in small groups in another section of the room. It was just really, really rethinking the model of how instruction was delivered. And a lot of their work was done on computers, and it was delivered to them individually. So it was literally, the assessments were personalized using learning technology.
Great. So I don't need much convincing about the 4 points in the model that you're recommending, but I do need persuading that you're still talking about what most Americans call public schools. It seems to me by taking away the middleman and having the funding flow with the kids, you have probably taken away the governance arrangements that most people associate with public education. So help me with the way in which these are public schools and that public education, as Americans think of it, remains the centerpiece of the system you're recommending.
Well, Checker, every single state in its constitution requires the creation of a public school system, and that is certainly not going to go away. I think it's still going to be the primary means. But we would replace centralized boards of education at the district level with school boards of education, and it would be school-based governance. The state would be primarily responsible for the funding. We wouldn't see the incredible inequities that we have across district lines, and would also be responsible for ensuring that schools maintained a basic educational opportunity. And obviously, parents would have far greater control and influence in this kind of system as well. Whereas in school systems like Chicago, where Kate worked, they have zero influence over their kids' education and the quality that's offered. So I think the combination of state supervision and intervention where necessary, state funding, and school-based school boards, plus parental involvement and empowerment, I think that's a recipe for a more accountable system than the one where right now the accountability is to elected officials, not to parents.
So,
and I would just add briefly that it's fascinating to me that after COVID, school board elections are some of the most hotly contested in this upcoming cycle. There are more people running for school board than almost ever before, I think, in American history. So I think that's a very good thing. Local control over schools should not be something that is a vague promise. It should actually be a reality. And parents are motivated to run by all sorts of things, but I generally see that as a very good trend.
Well, it's probably a sign of some kind of discontent with the current crowd. And that would be justified based on the experience of the last year and a half. I'm going to come back to accountability in a minute, but let me say what Clint described sounds to me awfully much like charter schools as I have come to know them over the last 20 years. And yet your main prescription in the book is for education savings accounts, which is a different form of school choice. So I would like one of you first to explain to our watchers what are education savings accounts, and then why do you prefer them to things that people already know better, like charter schools, which after all, is what I thought Clint was talking about.
So I would just add briefly, I think we try to focus on not one silver bullet solution, because that is where education reformers have gone wrong in the past. So we do think that ESAs offer the most flexibility and the most personalization for the 21st century, but we do still recognize that the vast majority of American students attend what are known as traditional public schools. But I can also just briefly say an education savings account, for those who don't know,
Before you do, just 1 second. You said traditional public schools. Are you putting charters in that category?
No.
Okay. So go ahead. The ESAs are what and how are they different from charter schools? Go ahead.
So ESAs are a more direct form of funding. Charter schools are publicly funded but privately managed. And ESAs are more of a direct funding directly to families. So it's a form of backpack funding, which we discuss in the book, similar to vouchers and tax credit scholarships. But what differentiates ESAs from vouchers and tax credit scholarships is that the money given to families does not need to be used at a traditional brick and mortar school. It can be used at a traditional brick and mortar school, whether it be public, private, charter, etc. But the money can also be used to pay for homeschooling pods or personalized educational services such as online school. So there's much more flexibility with how the funds are used. And as I mentioned earlier, West Virginia just passed one of these programs. Arizona has an ESA program. And it's also of great value to parents who have children with disabilities, because those children need personalized education more than any other family.
And Checker, oh, sorry, go ahead, Kate.
My last thought was that it also really helps enable homeschooling, which I think is used actually by a vast coalition of families, whether they be tech families in San Francisco or religious families in the Midwest.
And Checker, even though people are not familiar with this in most states at the K-12 level, they are familiar with it at the college level. They're called Pell Grants and other forms of aid, where you can use those Pell Grants for a wide variety of purposes, whether at a public school or private school or a trade school, et cetera, et cetera. And that's, right now, there are an increasing array of educational options available, both public and private, and allowing families to use the funds established for their children in the manner that best meets their children's needs seems to us to be exactly what we need.
I agree with that, but I'm also worried. I'm also worried about the potential downside, which is the abuse of the money by schools that are in it for the money, by parents that make choices for reasons other than educational quality. I guess I want you to talk about quality control here. Is anybody besides the marketplace checking to see that kids are learning anything in the schools that you are contemplating?
I can play devil's advocate for one second there about your second question, which is why parents might choose for reasons other than quality. So in my conversations with parents when I was teaching in Chicago, their number one overriding concern was safety. They wanted their kids out of their neighborhood from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. And my kids were in school very early in the day and they stayed until very late at night. So I think how we envision it in the book is, yes, quality schools are important, but also parents choose for a wide variety of reasons. So I'll just push back on that one point. And then
I'm welcome the pushback, but I'm also going to say from a lot of experience with, in particular, charter schools in Ohio, parents making choices for those reasons, which I respect, I understand. But those reasons don't end up solving the education problem facing the nation that Clint began with, which is the fact that we've got a poorly educated country. I've seen too many parents choosing schools for the reasons that you just described, safety, convenience, things like that, that are very important to parents. But if the kids don't end up learning reading, writing, and arithmetic in those schools, the country's still at risk, isn't it?
Yes, I think that's true. I would contend they were learning reading, writing, and arithmetic in my school, but it was a good school. But the parents chose it more for the safety than for the quality. But we were providing a quality education.
And Checker, your concerns, I think, are certainly very, very important. I don't think any of us would like the idea of money going to people who could just blow it on whatever they wanted. There are two main mechanisms. One is existent with education savings accounts, and the other is one that really is a matter of policy. And the first is that education savings accounts originated in my adopted state of Arizona. And they were modeled after health savings accounts, where basically you have a certain amount of money at your disposal, but they must be spent for the purposes for which they are designated. And for example, parents are essentially given a credit card, and the credit card can only be used for education purposes. And then they have to provide their receipts to the state as well. And the state has cracked down on parents who did not have educational intentions with the money. The second is that the state always has the power to determine how to measure educational success for any children for whom it spends money. And I think that that testing is certainly an option for these types of programs, and one that individual states would have to decide. But I have to tell you, as in my litigation days, the parents that I represented in school choice cases were themselves not well educated. They were almost always single parent families. They were often drug addicted. They were often unemployed. And they knew two things. They knew that their kids desperately needed an education. And they also all knew where their kids could get a good education. And it was remarkable to me, because it really confounded a lot of stereotypes that were thrown in our direction. And so I think that while the state has to make sure that all children are being educated, that the problem of parents who would misuse this program is far greater than the crisis in parents who don't have an opportunity to avail themselves of quality educational opportunities.
And just the last thought I would add as well is that, we look at what the public schools have been doing, and we don't really know how they've been spending the increased dollars they've been getting from both the federal and the state governments over the years. So accountability has to go both ways. If we don't adopt our system, I think we need to put even more accountability than we already are on the public school system.
I'd be fine with that. I'm just struck with the oldest sort of conundrum in education, which is the economist's argument about, is this a private good or is this a public good? It seems to me the only conceivable answer in the United States is it's got to be both. The parents are properly pursuing the private good. The state has to be pursuing the public good, which I think has got to be an educated population. And it seems to me we've got to have some way of verifying that that is occurring, not just that parents are satisfied with the places where their kids are going to school.
No, Checker, I think that's absolutely right. And I would certainly have no problem with accountability measures. The problem is that oftentimes a lot of those proposals are to basically shackle the private alternatives with the with the shackles that are destroying the public schools, like requiring certified teachers and requiring all sorts of other input obligations. And I know you're not advocating that, but one of the reasons why charter schools have been overall successful is that they tend to be judged by outcomes. And if they are not successful in their outcomes, in many states at least, they're shut down. And that's, you know, I think that's the kind of model we ought to be looking at for public schools going forward.
Okay, well, related topic. One of you talk about Florida, please. I'm a fan of Florida education reform too, but you make a big deal out of Florida as a kind of model in the book for ESAs and beyond. What's so great about Florida, and why should the rest of the country emulate it?
I think Florida, you know, as we portray it in our final chapter, is really the standard bearer for what education could look like in this country. And they just provide so much choice to parents. Their school choice program is a tax credit scholarship, which is a form of backpack funding, but is funded largely by corporations who receive a tax credit for donations they give to a nonprofit. The largest nonprofit is called Step Up for Students. It then distributes money to students in Florida, and it's a means tested program. So it goes to those who need choice the most, which are lower income families. Florida also during the pandemic was able to shift very quickly to a virtual environment because they have a statewide virtual school. This happened after we had already sent the book off to press, but it was a fascinating development that just underscored everything we had been saying.
Oh, go ahead, Kate.
No, I was done.
Well, yeah, the Florida Virtual Academy, I think is the name of it, was a godsend for kids across the country. Some school districts signed up to say, basically saying, we don't know how to do virtual education, let's employ someone who can. And then other states were able to access through their charter school laws those same opportunities. Florida also adopted some reforms within the public schools that I think are very, very important. For example, they ended third grade promotion. If you don't know how to read after third grade, you're not automatically promoted to fourth grade. And also, one of the things, as we mentioned in our book, is if you eliminate the middleman, you suddenly free up an awful lot of funds that can be used for classroom instruction, including triple-digit salaries for the best teachers in the school and in the country. And one of the things that Florida did was to reward its teachers for preparing their kids for AP examinations. And we saw an explosion in the number of Black and Hispanic kids in Florida, who now, by the way, outperform white students in many states around the country, taking and passing AP examinations. So incentives really do count. We have a system right now where in most states, all teachers with the same qualifications are paid the same, whether they're the worst teacher in the system or the best teacher in the system. And that simply has to change. And Florida was one of the states that led the way in allowing teachers to be compensated for their accomplishments.
So to get there, Florida perhaps had to be what we now call a red state, where they could not pay too much attention to those vested interests of teacher unions and other established interests. Is that a fair statement?
Well, Florida, I would put it a little less partisan terms. You have to have really strong leadership, political leadership. And one of the things that's been so depressing over the past year is we have seen movements designed to eradicate the disparities racial disparities that exist in our society, we've seen almost nothing said about education, which to me means that the main problem is being ignored. We can't forget that the leadership in both Milwaukee and Cleveland was provided by Democrats. Polly Williams in Milwaukee, Fannie Lewis in Cleveland. And at some point, it seems to me that education reform has to become a more bipartisan issue, because the people who need it most are people who are represented by and large by Democratic elected officials.
I agree with that, certainly. Back to Florida, though, the funding mechanism there, at least the one Kate mentioned, which is the tax credit scholarships, is big by school choice standards, but it's small compared to public education spending standards. So my question for you really is are mechanisms like this realistically scalable to replace or ESAs, if you prefer, to replace the funding system as we know it? Can you do it on a big scale?
I don't think that would necessarily be the goal. I mean, Clint and I talked about this a lot when we were drafting the book, but I went to a suburban public high school and it was fabulous. So I think, you know, we don't necessarily need to replace all of the district public school systems. We just have a different mechanism for how they are run. But that doesn't necessarily change how they are funded, other than the money is not going to the district, it's going directly to the school.
But it's going through a parental decision to take it to the school, if I'm following you correctly.
Correct, yes. But hypothetically, you know, if we were still faced with the choice of whether or not to attend the public school where I went, a lot of parents would still choose that school because it was a good school. So what it would prevent is parents from choosing the poor performing schools.
But what you are scaling here, if I'm still pushing for a second, is a different kind of funding mechanism. It's not a check written to the school system by the state, or raised by the school from local tax dollars by the district or the county or the city. It is funds flowing into the school through the parents, from the state through the parents to the school, if I'm following your system.
Well, Checker, I might weigh in with a personal anecdote. Earlier in my career, I went to the Northern Mariana Islands to talk about school choice, which gave me the slogan, "We will go to the ends of the earth for school choice." But I remember talking to a public school teacher there, and she was adamantly opposed to school vouchers. And she, you know, produced the usual litany of arguments against them. And I said to her, what about a system where the parents had their education funds placed at their disposal and could use them at a public school? And if they spent them at your public school, you and your fellow teachers and the principal could decide how they would be spent. And her eyes lit up. She had never contemplated that idea before. And she instantly said, we could finally get some new playground equipment.
Yeah.
I sometimes think that the school choice movement made a wrong turn when it focused on a mechanism that would be used exclusively at private schools, and failed to encompass public schools in a meaningful way in a greater choice system. And I agree with you, the challenges to scaling this type of idea are tremendous. But we have, at the end of the rainbow, the opportunity for school teachers to have far greater control over their educational environments and far greater compensation than they do today. And I am hopeful that the very same self-interest that drives parents to choose high-performing schools will drive many school teachers to say, you know what, this is the kind of system in which I would thrive.
Well, you need, I think, a state that's willing to bite the bullet that your book is recommending, and try to reconstruct its approach along the way that along the lines that you're both recommending. But I'm sitting here in Washington, and where the main debate is over how many trillions with a T of federal dollars to pump into everything, actually, including education. So I got a sort of double-barreled question here that I'm not sure is answered in the book. So let me try you. Is there a federal role in your recommendations? And that's question part one. Part two, will existing federal programs get in the way of your recommendations? I'm thinking of things like special ed and title, a lot of formulas that go through districts as we know them that take for granted the top-down system that we have today.
So, Checker, I do think that there is an appropriate federal role, and I hope my fellow libertarians don't burn me in effigy for saying that. But I do think that federal civil rights protections were very hard fought and have to be maintained. The answer to your second question is yes, emphatically, but those obstacles, I think, can be surmounted. And once again, the way has largely been led by charter schools, which are public schools and are subject to the very same federal requirements as other types of public schools. And they have been able to either modify the laws and regulations or adapt their own model in a way that, and that often involves pooling resources. That means that these laws and regulations have not been a devastating obstacle.
So you're saying there are workarounds on those things, or could be. That's not a fatal problem.
Exactly.
We've both been generous with me. I hope more questions than you really wanted. I hear that our studio audience, so to speak, has some questions of its own, and I think Kate's been looking at them. So I'm going to throw the ball back to her.
Thank you so much, Checker.
Yes.
You haven't heard the last from me. Go ahead, Kate.
So the first question that I'd like to pick up with is from Dave, and he asks, how much can be accomplished without parental interest? The Asian model shows just how important support at home is. How do we get parents actively engaged? Which I think is just a great question based off of what we have seen during COVID. So either of you would like to chime in first, I'll defer.
Well, I sort of alluded to the response to this, and Dave is, I think, absolutely right with regard to his premise. But in the families that I represented in the school choice litigation battles, I was very happy to discover that even though the parents were unable to themselves help their children terribly much, they recognized the importance of a high quality education, and they knew where to get one if the resources were at their disposal. One of the unreported phenomena of the micro-schooling movement over the last year has been in the minority community, with micro schools opening in churches, and parents discovering a safe place and a high quality academic environment for their kids. So while obviously the ideal is an engaged family that can actually weigh in and help their kids, for parents who aren't able to do that, the best opportunity is to make choices available to them.
I agree with that. I'm just going to mention two other sort of parent populations that worry me a little. One is the smug middle-class parent who is wrongly satisfied with the education their child is getting because the real estate agent told them they're living in a neighborhood with a great public school or something like that. And the fact of the matter is they're not learning very much. And then there is a small population of kids I think we have to acknowledge who do not have functional adults in their lives. Kids in foster care, kids in other institutional arrangements, orphans. It's kids who do not have functional parents or caregivers sometimes. So it's not a big population, but this is where the kind of safety net element of the state's role does have to come into play somehow in all of these arrangements. Back to you, Kate.
No, I think that's a great point and is well taken. I taught, unfortunately, many students with unstable home situations, so I saw it firsthand. I would say I don't know that that's a problem we address, because at its core, if every child had a stable family in this country, I think we would be a lot better off educationally than we are. And I think a good school can do some work to plug that gap, but it's never going to fully overcome the impact of a stable household. So it's a great point. It's well taken. If we could, we do have one more question, and unless Clint wants to jump in.
Oh, no. Q&A from the audience.
Okay. So this is a good one from Alex. What about the quality of teachers and the education they receive? In most high-performing countries, teachers graduate near the top of their class. At least in the past, we have tended to get our teachers from the lower echelon of graduates.
And that is an issue we talk about in the book. I am a graduate of a teacher training program, and we spent a lot more time talking about things that that diverted from our subject matter expertise than becoming really high quality people who could teach our subjects. And you're absolutely right. We have to emulate countries that have, like Canada and so many others, that have really professionalized the teaching profession. Compensation is an element of that. And I think that we have proposed the means by which to make that possible, which is eliminating the middleman and putting that money into the classroom, and greater public school autonomy to hire and fire teachers. And when you do that, I think that it will lead to greater high quality professionalism.
Just to add that requires a degree of deregulation on the part of the state as well, because today's private schools by and large can hire anyone they think knows their stuff and is competent with kids, and that gives them a much bigger field of candidates for their jobs, and much more flexibility with compensation and also with retention and placement and all those other things. We've got much too much of a, but your point, bureaucracy and kind of locked in structure in so many of our schools today. So we need a lot of freeing up there.
Yes, and building off of that, we have a very interesting question that deals with state board associations, which is not even something we take up in the book, but I'm sure is a form of bureaucracy. So this question is from Kristen. The most progressive program my district offered was their home study program. This month, we learned the district decided to end this. The rationale is there is no state education code specific to home study, and the state board association stopped recognizing home study. So all districts are terminating it. How do we stop the elimination of promising education programs like this?
You probably mean State Board of Education or something similar to that, the state rulemaking body.
Yes.
For my sins, I served 4 years on the Maryland State Board of Education, and I've seen the inside of the beast. I should also add that bizarrely, because of state regulations and laws, charter schools in Ohio do not currently have the right to offer online options to their students. And therefore, parents wanting a hybrid setup going into the autumn in a charter school in Ohio have to get it through a third party, because the statutory and regulatory arrangement is lagging behind, is all I can say, and doesn't make it possible in the charter schools today. So there are all kinds of ways in which states can mess up what would otherwise make perfectly good sense, such as the home study program she mentioned, and the Ohio hybrid opportunity that I just mentioned. I should say I once mentioned to a very prominent US Senator that when they turned responsibility for the federal stuff over to the states, the state I was in wasn't necessarily going to make very wise decisions, whereupon he suggested that we should elect a better legislature.
Okay, our next question is from John, and it's an interesting one. One initiative that state legislators, might wish to pursue, given all the new federal dollars in play, is to bank any existing surplus public school buildings and require that they be made available for new schools that you envision. Getting buildings today remains a major headache. Has any state solved this? I'm curious what Checker thinks about this because of your experience at the federal level.
Well, there's federal dollars, and there's also states and districts' willingness to do stuff with their buildings. This is a commingling of the two issues. The federal dollars are now coming with time limits. I mean, not real strict time limits. I believe districts have and schools have about 5-6 years to spend the relief dollars that they're getting, but not indefinitely. An issue with school buildings has been that even when states pass laws saying they should be made, that disused buildings should be made available for things like charter schools, there are often districts that own the buildings or cities that own the buildings find all sorts of excuses for not doing that. They'll say, well, we're using that building as a school warehouse, or something else. Meanwhile, charter schools are desperately operating in church basements and leased spaces and stuff like that. So it's a real issue of willingness at the state level and the district level to do anything like that with their buildings.
Any final thoughts from you on this, Clint? And then I think we should.
No, I entirely concur with Checker's analysis.
Wonderful. Well, do either of you have final thoughts you would want to share in general, besides, of course, buy the book if you're interested and you want to learn more? And if you're a parent, get involved, run for school board. We hope that you will be elected.
Run for school board, run for state legislature, start a school, get on the board of the school, be fussy about the school your child goes to, demand a better school for your child. There are an awful lot of to-dos tucked away in your excellent book. I congratulate you both on writing it and hope that lots and lots of people will learn from it.
Well, I would add, and thank you so much, Checker and Kate, for your thoughts today. This is a huge challenge, and we really didn't discuss this at the national or at the international level. We are looking up at the likes of Slovenia and other countries that we would never have thought could possibly be our competitors in the educational arena. And the country that is most concerning is, of course, China, which I know Hoover foreign policy scholars will tell you is an existential threat to the United States. And they are absolutely destroying us in K-12 education. One of the statistics from our book that was most alarming to me when I discovered it is that the bottom 10% of Shanghai students economically, the poorest 10%, outperform the richest 10% of American students in math. If that continues to be the case, the American era will come to an end. This is a national crisis, but it's also a national opportunity because over the last year, I think a lot of people who were, as Checker mentioned, the middle class parents who have been very satisfied with a very deficient product have become awakened and hopefully they will become advocates for change.
Well, I think we are good to wrap up, and we appreciate all of you tuning in today and to Hoover for hosting us.